Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, scene by scene. We're doing the prologue and Act 1, Scene 1 today. A little bit about the format. This is kind of podcast style, but a little bit quicker, and there will be some visual elements as well that might be beneficial to you. But for the most part, we're just going to be talking to one another and figuring it out as we go along, trying to give some good detailed analysis of each scene. Is there anything that you think, for people who are listening or watching this, that they need to know going into a Shakespeare play, just in general?
That's a great question. I think first off, it's not as intimidating as it might seem. The language is antiquated, but the jokes are the same kinds of jokes that we'd make. The action is a similar type of action. The emotions are just the same as we would have. And that it's okay to read something more than once.
Yeah, it's necessary in many capacities.
Yeah.
I made another short video about reading Shakespeare that I'll link up to. But I talk about in there that the first time you read a Shakespeare play, if you get 25% of it, you're doing quite well. Even if you're someone who's taught it and performed in it, read multiple plays, it's still very hard to read a play for the first time. So if you're struggling with the language, hopefully you're in the right spot. The other thing I'd add about just with Shakespeare is it can feel very boring in a classroom, but Shakespeare was not just an artist, he was also a businessman, and he had to succeed financially, and he did, so he wanted his plays to be exciting. You know, people weren't required to see them as students in Elizabethan England. They paid money. Yeah, all the Oxfordians coming down. But they paid money, and money was hard to come by. So to go see a Shakespeare play as opposed to partake in some other form of entertainment really meant something. And yeah, I think you see that right away in this scene, that it is quite exciting. So the language, as you mentioned, is very tough, but it's also the reason why we read Shakespeare is the language. Yeah. It's not the plot. He is borrowing the plot. We'll talk about changes.
Borrowing is a nice word.
Yeah, he's stealing the plot. We'll talk about some of the changes he made to it, but we read Shakespeare because of the language, not necessarily because of the plot. So don't be too intimidated by it. See it as an interesting challenge. So we're going to talk about three things with each and every scene that we do. For the first thing we're going to talk about, it's what do you need to know in this scene? What sort of information do you think is necessary that if you only get 25% of the scene on your first read, what do you need to make sure is in that 25%? Do you want to go first? What do you need to know?
I mean, I said this in the intro, somewhat as a joke, but the basics of the scene are the brawl. That's like the first part of it, right? The fighting. And you just kind of have to understand, mostly with some exceptions, who's on what side.
Yeah.
And then you need to understand the second part of that is the, as I lovingly referred to it, the emo boy.
Yes, the emo boy.
You just got to understand those two parts of the scenes. I think that's a wonderful description of our dear Romeo.
He is quite emotional in that first scene. Do you want to go into some details about what's going on with him, or why he feels... Why you feel he is an emo boy? Sorry to our set dressing here.
I mean, I might be skipping to a latter part of it.
Oh, okay. You can save it if you want to.
I'll save it. But I think that if you understand, you don't even have to understand every single relationship. You have the first few, Samson and Gregory, who come on. You don't necessarily even need to remember which side those individuals are on, just knowing that they're on opposing sides. And then you need to understand the relationships according to our two titular characters, right? Of the people who are going to continue past this scene, who are they related to?
Right, knowing who's on what side. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think there's actually three parts to this scene, though, because we have the prologue
before we even get to the brawl. The prologue.
And I think some readers, maybe myself, the first time I read this play, thinking back, already at the prologue, were a little confused. So if we take a look at the prologue, what sort of information... You had an interesting approach when you directed this. What sort of information do we need to know from the prologue? And what approach did you take when you directed it?
Information you didn't know. Okay. I've saved this for a later part of it, but Shakespeare straight up lies in this prologue, and it drives me crazy.
Okay, where does he lie in the prologue?
what does he say? The 2 hours traffic of our stage. I have never seen a production of Romeo and Juliet, even with cuts, that is 2 hours in time. That is ridiculous.
They didn't have watches back then, so...
No,
it's just estimating.
Can you imagine if he introduces it 3.5 hours, and then everybody just
scared
leaves?
a few people.
Might have. Okay, so I think what's interesting about a prologue like this is that you know that these two are doomed from the start by how it's introduced.
Yeah, the star-crossed lovers.
Right, exactly. And this isn't anything new. I mean, beyond just him borrowing this story, this isn't a new trope. But the households are alike in dignity.
Yes.
And I've seen some really interesting interpretations for that. There's a lot of color coding that goes on in productions just to help you keep families straight. And then they've seen some that are pretty racially driven. I've also seen some that are class driven. Which is interesting when you get to the alike in dignity. So, you have old money versus new money, and that makes more sense than I have, impoverished versus wealthy. That's not quite the same.
Right,
but,
yeah.
as far as how I took the prologue, I like having multiple people deliver it.
Yeah, sort of like a Greek chorus.
Sort of, exactly. And how I've seen it done in a myriad of ways, where you have it very much so like a chorus, where it's people who are living in this world of the Capulets and Montagues, so they're obviously affected by it, but they're neither Capulets nor are they Montagues.
Right.
So they're like a bystander of sorts.
Yeah.
And then I've had servants of the household. I've seen them deliver that back and forth, which kind of helps build the cadence.
Absolutely. And the two households being that Capulets and Montagues. And this is where I think maybe Shakespeare wasn't lying, but he might have been poetic with the prologue. I keep defending Shakespeare and you keep calling him out. You're probably correct on that. But the prologue is written as a sonnet, or a Shakespearean sonnet, obviously. And there's a real theme of two in there. You have the pair of star-crossed lovers, the two households, the two foes, and then the 2 hours traffic of our stage. So there's a real duality to this. And I think if you kind of read the prologue like a poem, but also keep in mind what you said, that these are characters delivering it, then it can be a lot of fun. It actually tells you most of what you need to know in this play. It kind of outlines the plot.
It does.
If you don't want spoilers, maybe don't read the prologue too carefully, but there's
you should read the prologue.
Yeah, I guess. It
starts the play.
There is some real... I just said too carefully, not... See, it was a pun on the twos in the prologue. There's some real famous lines in there. Obviously, the star-crossed lovers, people that are fated to not end up happy ever after, that the heavens themselves have dictated before the play's even begun, that they are not going to end up together. But yet they fight that with everything they have, which is where I think people fall in love with this play. One of the places. So that was excellent on the need to know. For me, for need to know, I put the Prince's Edict, that after the brawl ends between the Capulets and the Montagues, that this brawl has been going on for some time, and the prince is finally fed up with it. Prince Aeschylus says that anyone who fights from here on out is dead. That they are absolutely doomed. So he says, if ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. So the next person to fight is going to die. And the characters know this going forward. They're going to be arrested and executed without trial. And that's a really important plot point moving into future scenes, even if it doesn't come up for quite some time. Okay, excellent. So I think that covers need to know. There's other stuff in there, but ask questions in the comments if you need to. I want to start by talking about the challenge of this scene as someone who might be reading it in a classroom. And you already mentioned this, and that's who's on what side. With the Capulets and the Montagues being on different sides, you had talked about what are some strategies if you were watching this on stage as a director. What would you do for the actors?
I mean, I've seen very, very few productions of Romeo and Juliet where it's not done with costuming to help the audience out. Because I think if you, going into any Shakespeare play, but especially something like this, where it's so important what family you are from, usually there'll be, if not colors, very distinct styles. There'll be three. So there'll be the Capulet, the Montague, and then the House of the Prince. Because it's not just the prince who's related to himself, right?
Yeah.
So then that seems kind of to be like the neutral color. So often it's like red and blue.
Yeah, in my head I always see the Capulets as red.
Is it because of the rose?
Yeah, Tybalt is fiery, and that's kind of red, and Juliet's in love, red. And then Romeo, we talked about, is quite moody. So blue. Yes, an emo boy. But yeah, I think colors are great. But if you're reading that in a classroom, you don't get that. But what I tell my students is there's a lot of characters on stage. The only ones you absolutely need to know which household they belong to, even though you have Samson and Gregory and Abraham and all those other characters, you really just need to know that Benvolio is a Montague and Tybalt is a Capulet. Romeo comes in eventually after the brawl is done.
And hopefully you understand that Romeo is of his own house.
Yeah, that he's a Montague. But if you can get that Benvolio's on the Montagues and Tybalt's on the Capulets, then you have the parents, but they kind of go by their last name anyway. You've pretty much figured out where everyone kind of falls in.
Right.
Even if you don't know all the servants quite yet, that's okay. As long as you get those two, then you're good to move on. So, excellent. Did you have anything for the challenge? What do you think is the biggest challenge when
reading it?
When seeing the play or directing it for the first, or performing it for the first time, or reading it for the first time?
I think... So, because so many schools study Romeo and Juliet, they often want to perform it too. And I think it's one of those plays that if you cannot successfully do stage combat, I don't know if you can successfully do the show.
Absolutely. There is a lot of fighting in this show. A tremendous amount of fighting. Starts with a fight, kind of two fights.
Yeah.
Actually gets broken up by Benvolio.
Right.
At one point. And Benvolio, of course, his name derives from good, bene, so it means a good character. He's a peacekeeping character.
But it's interesting because, like, in that first scene, Benvolio is described as one of, like, the great swordsmen, someone to be, like, feared.
Yeah.
And then you don't really see him pick up a sword again.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. But yeah, you have to know stage combat, definitely. Or you have to be able to stylize it in a safe way that makes it look cool. But that's a selling point of the play.
It absolutely, I mean, it's captivating from the start for that reason. But I think as a director, when you're doing Shakespeare in general, you know that you have to add additional weeks to your rehearsal process because you're teaching in some ways another language.
Yeah.
And then when you add to it fighting, that's its own type of dance. So then you're adding extra weeks for that. So it's just something that takes a lot of time and a lot of confidence as an actor as well. It's also a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shakespeare doesn't tell you what to do. It says they fight.
And that's part of the beauty of Shakespeare is that it's so open-ended, so you can do so many different interpretations, but it's also kind of unnerving.
Absolutely.
You have to know what you want.
So if you listen to this, if you're a student reading this play right now and you're wondering, well, why do I find this boring? We're talking about the fight is one of the most exciting parts of the scene. When you're reading it in a classroom, you read, they fight. And then you move on. Whereas if you are watching it, you get to see this brawl with many people, and those are hard to direct. Lots of people on stage fighting, happening live in front of you. Which is very, very exciting. So you don't get that reading. Hopefully you get to watch some performances recorded if you have to, but live if you get the opportunity is phenomenal. So that takes us to our my favorite part of the video, pronouns. My favorite part of the video, which is what we love about the scene. So some scenes we definitely love more than others, for sure. But this is one of my favorite scenes. So do you want to go first? And what you love about the scene?
I mean, I talked a little bit. There's a lot that I love about it.
Yeah, go for it.
I talked a little bit. I think this is one of the greatest fights because it's one of the biggest ones that you get in Shakespeare. And I think in part because of the prologue, it's a safe one. which makes it, as an audience member and as a director, and as an actor in it, it makes it so much more fun because you just get to go out and have an all-out brawl, but without any of the risks.
Yeah, until the prince's edict, which happens after
exactly.
the brawl.
You
have free brawl.
Right. And when do you get that kind of opportunity? I mean, you have productions where sometimes there's even close to 30 people on stage. You have hand-to-hand, and then if you're going with a more period direction of it, then you have fencing. You have every type of combat that you can do safely on stage, all on there. And it's just so much fun, and it's so much fun to strategize. How do you have this go on stage for the audience? And like, as an audience member, when I've seen it, it's just been absolutely captivating. Because even, especially if you're paying attention to the prologue, because you are actually supposed to read it, then you don't have that same type of tension when you're watching the later fights in it. You're like, oh, this is just fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like, good old WWE.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, it starts with people biting their thumbs at one another and kind of talking like, did you bite your thumb at me?
Just
I bit my
good
thumb,
old
but was it at
smack
you?
talk,
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
they're not even sure why they're fighting, just that like their masters fight one another. So there's, it is a very fun fight. And that's where my favorite part of the scene comes from in the fight. And it's actually this one tiny line that I think most people miss, but it's maybe my favorite line in the entire play, which is when Capulet, old man Capulet, Juliet's father, comes out onto the stage for the first time in his gown. So it's evening, perhaps, or early morning, whatever time they set it in.
In his gown, could you modernize that for people?
That he would be wearing a long gown. No, it'd be like a sleeping gown.
He comes outside. Just imagine this old man coming outside in his robe.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Possibly his robe. Yeah. So Capulet comes out in his gown, in his robe, with his wife, and he says, "What noise is this? Give me my long sword, ho!" And then his wife responds, a crutch, why call you for a sword?" And this is really funny if you know some of the history here, because a long sword is an antiquated weapon by this time. They're using rapiers, they're using fencing weapons. So a long sword would be like a claymore, like what you've seen in Braveheart style sword, which would be absolutely not useful in this type of fight. It would be like running out into the street with a musket nowadays. Dangerous, obviously, but you're going to be laughed at for sure. And he calls for the sword.
Laugh at somebody with a musket.
Possibly. He calls for the sword, and he, when you directed it, your Capulet threw his back out, lifting the sword, and that's why Lady Capulet responds, "Why are you calling for a sword? You need a crutch." But I think it's so funny, and the prince even talks about this too, with the old hands grabbing their partisans, their weapons, that this brawl is even bringing out the elderly. So you have the young people who are fiery like Tybalt, but then you also have the old people who are coming out to fight. And I think it gives us an extent, or an idea of the extent of the feud, that this is a feud that's been going on for many, many generations. Perhaps people don't even remember why they're fighting to begin with. And it also, I think it's interesting to look at Lord Capulet as a character. He's one to keep your eye on as you read this show. He has some really funny instances, and I think the funnier you find him at the beginning, the more powerful the play actually is. And we'll talk about that when we get to some later scenes. But I think he's a really intriguing and interesting character, and one that audiences are drawn to if they read his lines carefully. He doesn't have a ton of lines, but the ones he has are quite funny at the beginning of the play. So, yeah.
My second favorite part of the scene, so we talked about the brawl. Now we got to talk about the
emo boy.
You got to say it right.
Emo boy.
All right. So, after this brawl, we have our titular character, or one of the two, good old Romeo. And he is met by his cousin. And I play the character of Benvolio, full disclosure. So obviously I have a soft spot for this character, but I also just love that this is the introduction that we get. We have this long conversation between Benvolio and Romeo's parents. That Romeo's just been moping in his room, sighing out a window, just being sad. And they don't know why he's so sad. Please, Benvolio, find out why he's so sad. And Benvolio's just like, I mean, all right. You know, you gotta do what you gotta do. And these are just some of my favorite lines. So just like the introduction that we get, we have Benvolio, good morrow, cousin, just like, hi. Ay me, sad hours seem long. Like, just, Romeo's just like, oh, is it a good day? It's so long. I'm so sad. And it just continues that way. And we see Benvolio being so patient at first. But then there's always a little bit of sass. What sadness lengthens Romeo's hours? And it continues this way for a bit, but then we just have Romeo goes on and on and on and on for like tens of lines talking about why he's so sad, how his days are so sad, how there's darkness and gloom, and if you want to know why I keep on referring to him as an emo boy, you would just have to consult this scene. You don't even need the rest of the play. I mean, you need the rest of the play, but he is wallowing. He is wallowing and in self-pity, and when you find out the reason for it, you just, how did I describe this? So if we go to like line 210, so this is Romeo and Benvolio going back and forth. Benvolio's just trying to get to the bottom of this because no one in Romeo's family knows. They're just letting him be his sad self. And we have preceding this, right? We have, tell me in sadness, who is it that you love? This is line 200. What shall I groan and tell thee? Groan? Why no. But sadly tell me who. And then we skip a bit. In sadness, cousin, I do love a woman. Benvolio, I aim so near when I supposed you love. Yes, I knew you loved a woman. Will you tell me about this woman? Will you tell me what's going on? And then we find out it's not even just that Romeo feels he loves a woman. No. We're gonna go to line just before 210. Well, in that hit you missed, she will not be hit with Cupid's arrow. She hath Dian's wit, and in strong proof of chastity well armed, from love's weak childish bow, she lives uncharmed. He is basically, how would you put this?
Well, that she is not going to procreate. According to Romeo, that when she dies, with beauty dies her store.
This emo...
she won't have children with me.
Yeah, this emo boy is upset. Not just that this girl doesn't like him back, but no. She won't sleep with him. And so he has locked himself in the room to sigh the day away.
Yeah, someone that he's not really in a relationship with at all. But
they haven't really even had much correspondence at all. And he's just wallowing.
Wonder why she's not interested. But it's interesting because it takes him 50 lines to tell Benvolio why he's sad, that he's in love, and then he only responds with, "Well, I love a woman." And why he was so near when you said you loved, right? And the idea that the scene goes on and on is very funny if you have a good Romeo Benvolio reading or on stage, because you have this friendship between them, and Shakespeare writes a lot of friendships into his plays. You know, Horatio, Hamlet, or Banquo, Macbeth for a while. And Benvolio, Romeo are one of those great friendships. There's other great friendships in this play as well, and we think about it being so much about love, but in many ways it's also about friendship and those conversations you have with your friends. And Romeo's disclosing this to his friend, his cousin, not to his parents, not to everyone else. But he should be teased for it because he's being ridiculous and
I think that's what I think. If you like you said, if you have a good Romeo and a good Benvolio, if they do a great job of showing that friendship, then you as an audience member kind of fall in love with Romeo, but not in a romantic lead kind of a way. He's a bit of a doofus. Yeah. He is. Like, I mean, you think about it, he is a teenage boy. We're not led to believe that this is out of character for him to mope because he's not getting something he wants. but he takes being made fun of in stride.
Yeah.
He doesn't get mad about it or, like, you know, aggressively defend himself. He just continues on with it. Like, I think there's part of him that knows he's being a little ridiculous about it, but he's just going to keep on going because when he feels big.
It's true. He does. He wears his heart on his sleeve, absolutely.
Just throws it at people,
which makes for some good comedy, especially at the party scene, which we're coming up on.
Boy.
So for the end of this here, I thought we'd just read the end of the scene. We'll just take these last two lines. We just have to read Benvolio since you played him. So we'll just talk about what the scene ends with so you know what to look for. Romeo says halfway through his last line, "Show me a mistress that is passing fair. What doth her beauty serve but as a note where I may read who passed that passing fair? Farewell, thou canst not teach me to forget."
I'll pay that doctrine or else die in debt.
Right, and teach me to forget Rosalind, the woman that he's supposedly in love with, or at least infatuated with. So Romeo's like, "You'll never get me to forget about this girl," and Benvolio's like, "Oh yes, I will. Figure out a way to do it."
Basically, that line is just like, bet.
Yeah, pretty much. And setting up our next scene. And one thing, Shakespeare is very confusing, but he's excellent at leaving a little hook to go into the next scene. So if you pay very close attention to the end of a scene, chances are you're going to be able to figure out where you're going at the next one. So with that, let's go ahead and call our first video here. So that was a big scene with the prologue and scene 1 of the act, and we'll move into the future scenes. Please leave your questions in the comments below along with any suggestions, and we'll try and get to all of them. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading.